I worked as a science journalist for many years, and I was always fascinated with scientific exploration in Antarctica. I first read about the Ross Sea Party about 12 years ago in Shackleton's own book, which was called South. The Endurance story is an amazing epic. It's absolutely the stuff of myth, but it was the Ross Sea Party's story that I found the most compelling. The efforts of Shackleton and his men to save their own lives after the loss of the Endurance boggles the mind, but the Ross Sea Party managed to persevere contrary to the very instinct of survival and self-preservation. Even after they lost their ship and supplies, they decided to try to fulfill their mission, even if it meant sacrificing their own lives. They believed the lives of Shackleton and 5 of his men depended on them fulfilling their mission, and that came first. Reading Shackleton's book, it's largely about the Endurance. He only spends a few chapters on the Ross Sea Party. I was so intrigued that I tried to find out more about the expedition, only to find out that there was very little out there. As I began searching archives and looking for material, I found previously unpublished material, and indeed material that had been thought to be lost or destroyed. Some of the expedition's records and archives were sent home to England in 1917 aboard a steamship, which was sunk in the English Channel just in sight of home by a German U-boat, and it was thought that most of the photographs and a lot of the records were in that wreck, and I found otherwise once I started my research. And as this material, this wonderful treasure trove grew, it became clear to me that this was a corner of history that hadn't been fully explored yet, and it was a very rich corner indeed. It's an important chapter in the history of polar exploration, and I feel it has been a real special privilege to be able to create the most comprehensive chronicle of the men in those events. I've been to Antarctica twice. The first time was in 1999 when I spent 6 weeks sailing in the Weddell Sea on the opposite side of the continent, which was Shackleton's destination when he sailed in the Endurance in 1914. Then in 2002, I was a participant in the National Science Foundation's Artists and Writers Program, and I spent 2 months in the Ross Sea region, which is where the Aurora sailed with the Ross Sea Party. I was there during the summer, from October until December, when temperatures are typically in the teens or 20s, sometimes as high as the 30s. But unlike the Ross Sea Party, who were wearing homemade clothing made from discarded tents and sleeping bags, I was wearing layer upon layer of high-tech fabrics topped off with a down parka. Still, when I was in the huts where the men had lived, which are still standing around Ross Island, remarkably preserved, with the men's possessions sitting on their bunks as they left them. In one particular hut, there's a pan of seal meat sitting on a stove that was the last meal that was left there when the men departed. It's incredible. The atmosphere has been preserved since 1917, and the damp, dank cold just penetrates to the bone. And the huts reeked of the smell of seal blubber that the men had to burn for heat, which had also covered the walls with a black, greasy soot. But while the temperatures were still a bit more manageable around Ross Island that time of year, one of the most vivid experiences for me was the week that I spent near the summit of Mount Erebus, which dominates Ross Island above the huts. I visited a science station there, and of course because of its altitude, the conditions are much more extreme. The temperatures were typically 20 to 40 below 0 Fahrenheit. Wearing modern gear, you can stay pretty comfortable, but when the wind started up, all bets were off. It just seemed absolutely impossible to keep warm. The whole time I thought of the Ross Sea Party, trying to camp in even worse conditions, wearing what amounted to rags, and it's so hard to fathom how they came out of it alive. Perhaps even more difficult is the notion of how they managed to keep hope alive in those circumstances. Because for me, I knew that the station was in regular communication with the base, that the U.S. Antarctic Program had full search and rescue capability. For the Ross Sea Party, stranded in Antarctica, their ship gone and presumed sunk, they had no logical hope of rescue whatever. It was like being on Apollo 13 without mission control to guide them through it all. I located the descendants of many of the expedition members who were all very generous in sharing their memories and often relics that they had inherited from their relatives and writings of the men. Some of them are really terrific genealogists and shared family history and anecdotes with me. Even though the relatives were familiar with their own family papers and were familiar with what their relatives had been through, quite often they didn't know the entire story until I began my research. Some of the material was unknown, hadn't been identified yet. And I think consequently, they also didn't fully understand the magnitude of the men's heroism. So I'm really looking forward to sharing that and celebrating the men's achievements. Since so little has been written about the Ross Sea Party up until now, the relatives are very modest about their ancestors, and I think it's about time for them to enjoy the limelight 90 years later. I think the most remarkable thing about the Ross Sea Party is that they were ordinary men who did the extraordinary. They didn't join the expedition for glory to go down in the history books. They knew when they went south that the job was to support Shackleton, and at best it would be an adventure. Then when their ship disappeared in a gale, leaving them with totally inadequate supplies and just the clothes on their backs, they made the decision to carry out their mission no matter what the cost was to themselves. They were willing to risk their own lives simply because other people's lives depended upon them. They had promised to do it, and they meant to keep the promise. They were undoubtedly heroes, but they were still human. They had their flaws and shortcomings, but they were still able to summon up the courage to perform a supremely selfless act. When I set aside the role of historian and speak on a personal level, I find their integrity tremendously inspiring. It says ordinary people are capable of singular things. You don't have to be a so-called born leader with mythical attributes to dig deep and make a shining contribution to humanity, and I think that's a powerful message.